This is Duke University.
So we're now going to start the panel on mobile technology innovations. We have three esteemed panelists with us. And what we will do, and this is how it will be, we'll start off with introductions. I'll introduce myself, and then these three esteemed gentlemen will introduce themselves. And after that, I'll ask them a few questions, and then I'll open up to the audience to ask them any question you want to ask them, particularly like on mobile technologies, not any question you want to ask them. All that's up to them. They can answer anything they want. Okay, so let me start off with introducing myself. My name is Rishabh Gandhi. Some of you, or most of you already know me. I'm a Fuqua student, a second year. Why am I here? I was working in Africa for an year for a mobile company. It was earlier called Zain, now it's called Airtel in Africa, working in Kenya for a year. Traveled around 15 odd countries, was heading the total rewards vertical for that particular company, and had a really, really good time in Africa. And I do, honestly, from the bottom of my heart, believe that the things that the mobile phone can do in developing countries is really, really great. The power of a mobile technology in a developing country is awesome. With that, I will pass on and start the introductions. We'll start off with Dr. Mocha Lantum. Sorry, I'm starting from left to right. Yeah.
Maybe.
I think you already have your mic.
Sure, yeah, I do have my mic. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Mocha Lantum. I'm a physician and managing director for Microclinic Technologies. We're a company that's headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, and I represent a fantastic group of staff that have really stuck with us for the last 5 years. And I thought it would be, do we do the introductions first before we do opening comments, or we do opening comments at the same time?
I would love if we can do introductions and then opening comments.
Okay, that's easier. So what I wanted to talk with you about is really just share a story, and from two fronts. One, I think my personal story, and secondly, sort of what we've learned, and what how that projects in the mobile technology space. I would say that when I started this work after 12 years in corporate America, I saw myself answering one major question, sort of what is the opportunity for our generation? And I thought about it in the sense that, my grandparents, they led the movement towards independence. My parents, or our parents, led the movement towards, establishing, the public sector, big government, and our generation's call was to build private sector. So with that perspective, I embraced the opportunity to set up a business in Africa, more from a generational opportunistic perspective above all. And so failure was not an option. And I think that guiding mindset going into the entrepreneurship space has allowed us to weather the storms, and I think it is showing results. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. Now, I thought I'd sort of tease your minds with this picture because, yes, Africa is rising, and it is rising indeed. So it's not those on the ground are seeing the impact in real time. When I started in 2010 in Nairobi, it was very different than what it is now today. But what this map, you can draw many conclusions from this figure here, but I'd like to interpret it in my own terms, and from the mobile technology perspective specifically, to say what this sort of shows is that we are at a very advanced stage in the hype cycle. If you're familiar with technologies, there's what's called the hype cycle of technologies. And so the first phase is the innovation trigger. Everybody says we can develop something, we can create apps, you can do this, you can do that. Then it sort of goes to a peak of inflated expectations, whereby what it can do is over and above, never going to be accomplished. And then it goes through a trough of disillusionment, where everybody says, well, this is not going to happen, mobile is not going to happen, internet power, a very serious pessimism, and then a phase of enlightenment and productivity. What this figure shows is that we finally have reached, in my mind, the phase of enlightenment and productivity, whereby mobile solutions and mobile technology is part and parcel now of every operation. Now, that is, as you can see from this map, from this figure here, it is happening in 3 major sectors: e-commerce, internet services, and payments. But my interpretation as an entrepreneur is that what are people purchasing? In my mind, they are purchasing 3 things in the market. They are purchasing choice, they are purchasing control, and they are purchasing convenience. Choice, control, and convenience. So that is what we're selling in the market using the technology platforms. Now, when we look at the sectors that are where that gain is happening, from an entrepreneurial perspective, there are 2 major trends that we're seeing in the market. One trend is around enterprise solutions, and the other trend is around direct-to-customer solutions. And those are 2 very different markets. Now, the e-government sector, the hotel sector, and the logistics sectors are sectors that we're seeing a lot of growth. But as innovators and entrepreneurs, if you're competing in that space, you're going against SAP, Microsoft, the big companies. So those of us who went to market with enterprise solutions, we faced heavy competition out of the gate. On the direct-to-customer side, that's where we're seeing also a fair amount of innovation, but not a lot of scaling. That is in the agro sector, the education sector, and the healthcare sector. And that brings me to my company. So we are in the healthcare sector, and I'd like to say we're a pretty dominant player in the East Africa market, whereby our products are visible to most governments and a lot of the private sector players. And when our first product is called ZD, and we have over 9,000 potential customers in the in Kenya market, over 20,000 in the East Africa market alone, and then potentially 100,000 users in if you look at the Sub-Saharan Africa market. There are lots of lessons that we had to learn there, but to cut the long story short, for us to pull off this product, an enterprise solution, we had to do a lot of partnerships with the large corporations for that to work. So we're partnering with Huawei Technologies to provide the backbone for connectivity, power, and equipment to pull this strategy off. So the thread here is that the enterprise solution almost requires sort of a serious, significant partnerships with some of the large players, Microsoft, Google, and the likes, to pull that off. And that creates a certain leadership imperative, or a certain imperative on the leadership. When you think about yourself as an entrepreneur, you kind of have now to sort of rethink your partner strategy to pull that off in the enterprise space. We also recently pivoted to the direct-to-consumer space, where we have a solution that connects patients to health facilities. The bottleneck being that with the 9,000 patients facilities that are in Kenya, most of them, the majority that we've interviewed, are functioning at 25% of capacity. So if you build it, it's not necessary that patients would come. So we found the opportunity to innovate around how can we connect patients to facilities. And our solution is able to identify unmet needs based on information we're collecting on the individual, and we try to connect them to healthcare services. This has also required us to partner with large corporations to pull this off, and that's something I'd like to talk about later. In closing, I just thought I'd leave you with a few thoughts as an entrepreneur in the mobile technology space. Yes, it's growing, but the big decisions that one has to make in this market space are as follows. Do you want to do in-house development, or do you want to do outsourcing of your platform? That is something that is a major conversation in the market right now. And that is determining whether we form South-South partnerships with India partners or with North America partners or European partners. Secondly, our business models. the business models in the African market for the mobile technology space are very different than the business models we're seeing from large-scale mobile technology companies in the developed markets. And so that's an area that you'd have to think about very clearly. And then lastly, there is an imperative to have a fair amount of value-added services to your mobile technology platform above and beyond the app. So I was talking to one of my colleagues there, and she's also a mobile technology entrepreneur. And really, the big part about the 70% of our work is around building the service platform associated with the technology. And so one has to think about that very carefully. So those are my introductory comments, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lantom, for that wonderful introduction and your perspective on the entire Africa mobile telephony technology innovations, and also on the fact, thank you for leaving us with a few questions to ponder about. I would now love to ask Victor to give his introduction and any opening remarks that he has, and tell us about his company also.
Okay, thank you very much. Rishabh, okay. I saw the bio that they wrote there, and I was just laughing. If somebody should ask me, okay, who I am. You want me to introduce myself to you? First of all, I'll tell you, I'm a fish farmer. That was what I was trained to do. I was originally a hydrobiologist, but I took a sabbatical in tech. So I'm still going to go back to fish farming because Chief Ibru, one of the richest Nigerians, actually advised me, when we did a pitch to him for the first mobile telephone company in Nigeria, Econet, that I should go back to fish farming. That he became rich, selling fish. That all what we're doing now does not make sense. So I'll tell you more about the sabbatical, what I've been doing during my sabbatical as a techie. Like I said, I did my first degree in hydrobiology. Left school at 19, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Got in at 15, came out at 19, I had absolutely no clue. A lot of guys in Africa are like that. Uganda, you have over 70% of the population under 15. They are clueless, they don't know what to do. Nobody knows what's next. Okay, the plan was maybe you be a medical doctor, go to med school and all of that. Then we had this 1 year of national service in Nigeria where, I stumbled across a relative who was into consulting. So, I decided to work with him, for that 1 year before making up my mind, about continuing to either to do a master's in biology or go to med school. And, something very, very interesting happened. I discovered tech, and I discovered that I had a passion, for it. And, it was still early days in Nigeria, and it was actually totally stupid for somebody to say, okay, look, this is what I want to do. I want to take it as a career, because, there were really no careers in technology at that time. So, and I was very, very stupid. I actually started a company, called Swifter at that time. I had this co-founder who was equally stupid. We were lucky also to have worked at a company called Geisen Technologies. Geisen happened when IBM was nationalized in Nigeria. So a local entrepreneur now decided to run it as his own entity. What were they doing? They were just basically selling IBM products. The largest selling IBM product at that time was the IBM Selectric typewriter. So I got in there as a trainer. And the very first project we worked on was Chevron Nigeria. Chevron ordered 300 typewriters. Then they got me in there to train their secretaries, show them how to use the PCs. The IBM PC 80 was just launched. They bought one. After we did the training, they sent back all the typewriters and ordered 300 PC80s. So the typewriter business in IBM died, and that was it. So, and, immediately there was transcendence. Chevron stopped using typewriters. The typewriter business died. And I realized immediately that this was something. For that kind of thing to happen, to Chevron, it was something that was going to, scale rather rapidly. And I put my bet there, and I wasn't wrong. The next frontier was mobile. There's another story on how I got there, which I can't go into now. But basically, I lost a lot of money. I had to go back to work for a relative who, at that time, was also invested in mobile technology. He invested in Econet Wireless Nigeria, and I was part of the project team. At that time, I remember when we were trying to convince, because we raised about $285 million for the licensing round, trying to convince one of the investors. The guy asked me, he said, in India, they have 1 billion people, but only 3 million mobile telephone subscribers. Why do you think it's going to be different, in Africa? I told him, okay, Africa is different. This is going to happen. Africa is going to be the biggest mobile market. He thought I was crazy, but he still invested some money anyway. By the time they exited to Airtel, I think he had put in roughly $10 million, and he got a 5x return, on that. So which was, nice by Nigerian standards. So, now, basically, let me talk about Africa. Africa is the last frontier. I was here. I've been here now for a couple of days. Okay, they say they have Apple Pay. I actually, set up my Apple Pay account, but I couldn't find anywhere to use Apple Pay. But that's actually very, very different in East Africa. I set up my M-Pesa account, and I could use it immediately. There were a lot of use cases. There are a lot of things I could do with it, immediately. Now, as Dr. Muka said about generations, after the colonialists came, okay, there was a period where everybody was in the public sector, because that was where you had to be at that time. There was a kind of transcendence from the colonial era to self-determination. So we had that kind of transcendence for that generation. Each generation brings a different kind of transcendence. For our own generation, like he rightly said, it was entrepreneurship. We decided, okay, look, I decided I wasn't going to do the same thing my parents did for 30 years. I wanted to do something different, which is why I actually did what I did and lost a lot of money. And each generation, as you're actually transcending, there's something I noticed, that there's something unique to each generation. There's always a platform of connected people, okay? Now, that platform of connected people was actually accelerated by mobile, in Africa. People cannot seem to understand why, mobile scaled the way it scaled in Africa, because there were existing value chains, there were existing, structures that were there that had a lot of inefficiencies. Mobile just came in and actually made things a whole lot easier. So we're actually entering, maybe the generation after ours, because, a lot of the things that we think we are doing now, I think is just the tip of the iceberg in mobile in Africa. So we're actually entering another phase of transcendence. M-Pesa is just the beginning. That's just, one of the stories. Mobile is a platform, and is a platform for the next stage of transcendence in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And a really wonderful thought that mobile is a platform on which innovations and further things can be built upon. I would now like to invite Professor Stan to just give his introduction and any opening remarks that you have.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this morning. I'm not going to be anywhere near as interesting as these two guys, but I will just do a brief introduction. I've been teaching and researching in digital health innovation and biomedical informatics for 25 years, first 5 years at Quinnipiac University, and the last 20 at Columbia and the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi. Over the last 5 years, I've been affiliated with the University of Ghana School of Public Health and been the co-principal investigator for a Gates-funded grant, monitoring, learning, and evaluation grant for something called MOTEC. Have any of you heard of MOTEC before? A couple of folks. It's the mobile technology for community health platform that the Gates Foundation funded, and we did an analysis of looking at how a voice messaging platform of pre-recorded voice messages to moms, roughly 2,000, one in AAK and one in Gamoa West. These two districts, case control, quasi-experimental design, actually improved outcomes for vaccination rates, malaria control with mosquito netting, and clean water technology. And we found that not necessarily all of your hypotheses, when you think about mobile making change and making behavioral change to improve things like infant mortality, are necessarily correct. And this is something I've learned in my 25 years of course this is going to make a difference. Let's try it out and see what happens. Kind of quick, rapid pilot tests for a month to 3 months to see what happens. And almost every single time, whether it was looking at whether activity improved or reduced mortality rates for congestive heart failure patients, and it turned out that it's actually sleep for them that's more important and more predictive, or lack of sleep for major events like death. Or whether it was, hey, let's put an e-health van in northern India and see all the outcomes for folks in Chandigarh go up, and assume that that's going to actually happen, and it didn't. So a lot of the interventions that we saw with MOTEC in Ghana were not actually there, although there were other outcomes of this vast deployment, the largest actual analysis and monitoring learning exercise for mobile health ever, in terms of doing a 2-year study of a mobile health intervention in West Africa. And it came down to other behaviors were affected by mobile health that we hadn't anticipated, like breastfeeding skyrocketed. So the moms didn't have to take time off from work and travel to get vaccinations for their children, but and receiving reminders, roughly 96 over about an 18-month period, the breastfeeding rates did go up substantially. And the trust level for their public health workers also went up substantially. So there were far-reaching public health benefits from MOTEC that ended up not being as substantial as we thought they would be for vaccination rate and for malaria control, for clean water technology, et cetera. But there were other non-hypothesized outcomes that were achieved from mobile technology. And so part of, I think, what we're talking about here is something that a theorist from the University of Michigan about 20 years ago highlighted and wrote a book about called sense-making. Sense-making is the art and the science of making the correct decision under a highly compressed time frame when you have discrete resources and your sustainability and even your life is at stake. This entire model was highlighted by a case that Don Berwick wrote in 2004 called The Escape Fire, which some of you may have read, which is absolutely brilliant. It's about 30 pages. I would highly recommend it. The Escape Fire talked about a different point in sense-making in terms of how people's lives can be changed. And then in the financial crisis in the US, we saw sense-making at its height when we saw some firms that had been around for hundreds of years or over 100 years, financial firms collapse because they did not sense-make properly. And others succeed because they sense-made, they used their networks to their fullest degree, they changed policy in the highest levels of the land, and they're around still today because they sense-made properly. The other theorist that I want to talk about just for a moment here is, again, quite brilliant, now deceased, but he wrote a book called The Diffusion of Innovations. Again, I would highly recommend you reading this book. The Diffusion of Innovations was first written in 1964. And Everett Rogers created this book out of the TRACE methodology. The TRACE method is a sociological methodology that actually uses interviews and archival research to go back in time, and he was looking particularly at nuclear energy and vaccines like polio and smallpox to determine how did these come to be when so many other innovations had not come to be. And he came up, if you read his book, you'll see a number of variables that actually are prescribed to the diffusion of innovations around the world. And eventually, when you put his book together with what the World Health Organization did in 1979, which was eradicate smallpox, you begin to see on these overlaid models, you begin to see just how the diffusion of innovations can, in fact, save hundreds of millions of lives over 50 years on this planet. And so whether it was the talk before when we talk about energy and literally trying to save the planet with new, cleaner energy tools, or whether it's the diffusion of innovations through mobile tech in Africa, where we can literally have an impact on literally hundreds of millions of lives over 10 years and save millions of lives through these other controls, through these either behavioral controls, syndromic surveillance controls, or triage, or supply chain. The mobile technology platforms that we have in Africa today can vastly change those four processes and make healthcare better. So we're not talking about something that's going to happen in 10 or 20 years. We're talking about something that's happening today. And it's really a convergence of several things that we have in this room, the power to affect. One is understand the proper methodologies for doing the evaluation and learn from people like Mark Zuckerberg, who did small, quick pilots in his dorm room at Harvard to find one of the most transformational platforms and build one of the most transformational platforms in a generation in Facebook. And again, so let's think about that for a second. Small, quick, cheap pilots. Let's learn quickly, pivot toward the right transformational and scalable, and most importantly, diffusive technology that can save and impact lives immediately. And secondly, let's think about the access to capital, again brought up in the last presentation. Having capital that's flowing and can move quickly, whether it's through crowdfunding or other sources, so we can get to those innovations quickly. So again, they can diffuse more rapidly is critical. This is healthcare, right? Healthcare is really different than toys or clothes or cars, right? Healthcare is critically important, whether you're talking about sanitation technologies, whether you're talking about electronic medical record technologies, whether you're talking about diagnostic devices or vaccinations. All of these are elements of healthcare technology. Technology obviously is the definition, sits around the actual constructs of science applied to society. That is the definition of technology. And innovation, as a definitional term just for the panel, is the ability to do something today that is better than yesterday. So let's use that as a definition of innovation, just as a very rudimentary common denominator. So how do we figure out if something is truly innovative? We need to test it. We need to understand, is it better clinically? And these are the three main components for healthcare. Is it better economically? And is it better experientially? If these public health workers in Ghana have a messaging tool that's very easy to use and they can pop out messages like that because it's so well designed from a user experience standpoint, we're going to be all better off. If we're making better medical record systems that have voice integration, script to text, touch screen technology, and are on a mobile network, that's going to be so much better of an experience than even paper today. So we have a chance within your generation, within our generation, to truly have an extraordinary impact in Africa and all around the world in this area. And I hope we can talk more about that now.
Thank you, Professor Stan, for this wonderful introduction, opening remarks, and telling us as students the opportunity that we have in Africa in particular and on diffusive innovations. As the first thing I would love to ask the panelists, the first question is, and most of you broadly covered it, but if there is something more to add, I would love to hear that out. It's about what role do you see mobile or technology innovations playing in the broader development of African nations? Is a really good mobile or technology innovation essential for a country to take that next big step in their development cycle? And I can give you an example. when mobile telephony reached DRC in particular as a country, the country has a big forest in the middle. Once the mobile technology reached there, the connectivity improved. A lot of businesses propped up because of that. So do you, in your experience, have you in your experience seen that? And what role do you see mobile phone and technology innovations playing right now and in the future? We can start off with Stan and come this way on this.
Fantastic. No, thank you. I think I mean, it's so vast, right? I mean, the answer is so vast. And again, I'll stick to healthcare because that's really all I know. I don't want to pretend to know anything else. But it really is in healthcare. Let's go back to those 4 value chains that I talked about just for a quick second. Supply chain, syndromic surveillance, certainly being able to triage things in a much better fashion, and then even just general information. I think when you look at reinventing a health system, and I think that is the opportunity right now that health ministers around Africa are trying to understand. There's been no better time in history to bring more health information to more people at a lower cost per unit. And it's also an extraordinary time in history. Thank you to predominantly a lot of the generic manufacturers in India, who, by the way, we should all remember that India provides 90% of the world's medicine to all but 25 nations in this world, okay? So let's remember that India is literally the pharmaceutical breadbasket for the globe, and when it comes to being able to tie India together, which, by the way, if you've been to Africa, you'll see lots of Indian doctors. You see Apollo, Fortis, Max Healthcare, all around the continent. And so beyond just wireless, like Airtel, India and Africa have a tremendous relationship in healthcare as well, which I think is important to note. But that ability to use mobile as a way to not just provide information to extraordinary levels of detail to people that have maybe never had it before, but also technology, whether it's a pill, a diagnostic, again, like a mobile a telemetry device or a mobile sonogram, something like that you now have $7,000 a pack that can be used. So mobile can be used to help understand where to triage those technologies. If you look at Haiti, 2009, Port-au-Prince, earthquake happens. What does the UN do immediately within 24 hours? It lands 2 large, remote, literally the size of a phone booth, mobile telecom stations with batteries into Port-au-Prince airport. And it's set up immediately. What's it used for? It's used predominantly for the first week, and later it was used for police force and whatnot, but the first week it was used for mobile healthcare. Literally, I did a report for them about 6 months later on evaluating that whole project, and it was extraordinary. They were able to bring antibiotics to people that had massive wounds. They were able to bring surgeons to the intake units, the hospitals that were taking in most of the patients. So those mobile units were critical to saving hundreds, if not thousands, of lives in Port-au-Prince within the first week to 2 weeks after that earthquake. So think about that as a national health system model, using mobile phones for not just the urban areas, but also the rural areas, being able to bring in technologies, whether it's a diagnostic device, whether it's a batch of vaccinations or a batch of antibiotics, whatever it might be, medical supplies, it could be blood, it could be gauze, it could be antiseptics, whatever it might be. But that's a massive reinvention of what we have today, where the supply chain even in many of the areas of Africa is significantly broken. So we're seeing that. And then if you look at my colleague's work, Michelle Odlum from Columbia University School of Nursing, look at her study that was released 6 months ago on how Twitter predicted the outbreak of Ebola before anyone else did. So she did an analysis of tweets and looked at how tweets had predicted Ebola's spread across West Africa into Nigeria, et cetera, and how that tool, as a social media tool, was highly predictive. And again, syndromic surveillance. Now we're using social media, but that's driven by mobile, right? We're not talking about a bunch of folks sitting around on laptop computers in Nigeria and Guinea, et cetera. We're talking about people using their smartphones. So that is highly, highly mobile driven. So I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface on how mobile technology can change healthcare for the better in the continent. I think it's, again, it's people that are here in this room today that can have that significant impact just to going forward.
Thank you.
Sure. Definitely, there's no question about it. And I'd like to deconstruct the mobile technology space into three layers. There is mobile for mobile's sake. Basically, can you speak on the phone? And when you think about in that space, feature phones do a great job. And then there is the mobile technology for payment. And that's, again, we've heard about M-Pesa. But then where the market is right now is mobile technology for services. And that's a whole different ballgame. What we are struggling with in terms of when we're thinking about business models and thinking about how we are going to launch products, there is a little bit of tension between the penetration of feature phones, smartphones, and that kind of stuff relative to the service models that are going to market. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit here. In my mind, the solutions in the service area would drive the uptake of the mobile devices in the marketplace. That is sort of where the market is right now. So the market is really hungry for solutions. In the education space, we're seeing a lot of innovation where people are putting textbooks on mobile phones. Curriculums are coming real time from decentralized locations. You have Bridges International, that is a good business model for that. And we're seeing that also happening in India, whereby now, regardless of the location, as long as there's a 3G network, you can have very high quality science, technology, and engineering curriculums getting to areas where you do not have teachers. So it sort of flips the whole development industry on its head, because the development industry by default has been defined by the availability of capacity on premise in order to deliver value. Whereas with these mobile service and mobile applications, in the service ecosystem, it becomes a game changer. The other one, which is very transformational for farmers, more than even the visibility of prices, is mobile insurance for farmers. Kilimo Salama is one of the best business models around that, where they are able to insure farmers' yields based on their predictive analysis of weather patterns, and they're pushing that to the phone. Again, it is allowing farmers to take more risk, and we're seeing huge impacts in that space. So the big challenge, I think Victor touched on it, between, let's say, like the Apple Pay system and M-Pesa, is that, you know, if one is designing for the African market particularly, what can you do to make sure the impact is immediate? And we have to think about it very carefully, because a lot of the business arguments for using technology are based on models around efficiency and paperless, and those are long-term value propositions that the African market does not really care for. For example, when we launched our first product, we're going to hospitals telling them about paperless, you'll be efficient, you'll be able to do accounting. That is telling him that the value of our solution is coming in at month end. Whereas he wants solutions, you know, something that creates value immediately. So we've had to redesign a whole business process to say it's not only sufficient to have a digital health record. What can that digital record do at the time the service is being delivered for the patient and for the healthcare provider? And that is what defines the success of application, not necessarily efficiency and the bigger questions that one would think about when you're thinking about when one puts technology adoption into focus. So in a nutshell, yes, mobile technology development mobile technology is the key for development. And we are going to see a trend whereby solutions are driving uptake of smartphones like we've never seen before. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lantham. Victor,
All right.
we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, okay. What was the original question again? Just rephrase it again so I can.
Okay, what I was basically asking was, what role do you see mobile innovation playing in the development of African countries? And do you think it's critical for an African nation, or is mobile technology or innovation critical for an African nation to take that next big step in development?
Okay. Mobile first of all, there's a subset of technology. Technology is basically change. You're moving from one state, to another. Now, innovation, on the other hand, is very, very different. It's more or less like transcendence. You're moving from, you're actually creating what was not there at all in the first place. Now, in Africa, like I said, there's been change. There's also been transcendence. Africa is actually what was and it still is the most connected place, on earth. We're connected to our families. We're connected to our communities. We have had existing value chains, and all of those things were accelerated by mobile and technology. I give the instance of a company where they were using typewriters and immediately they got rid of them and started using PCs. Now that rate of change, I don't think you can see that anywhere else in the world. In Africa, it's usually very, very, drastic. And with that kind of thing, comes, there are a whole lot of things with it. Look at the Arab Spring in North Africa. Twitter disrupted, entire governments. So there's a double-edged thing to technology, in Africa. It can actually be something that creates progress, and it can also be very, very disruptive. So it depends on where we want to go with that transcendence. So that's actually very, very important. Like you're talking about, Dr. Muka was talking about impact. How do we get immediate impact? Now with value chains and communities, the impact has actually been right there. Because I remember there was a project we're on. Because a lot of people don't understand why the mobile technology grew so fast in Nigeria. When we started as Econet came from Zimbabwe. Econet had this distribution model in Zimbabwe that was actually based on building their own shops, creating their entire distribution. We were competing with MTN, who had been there for 4 years, who had actually studied the market before they even got a license. What MTN now did was build on the existing value chain. They were not building their own shops. They had an existing informal retail value chain that was there. So MTN spent nothing on distribution while we were spending 185 million naira to build each shop. So of course, they took off rather rapidly. So, and with that, they started creating new jobs. The retail value chain changed, in structure immediately. Now, if you also look at East Africa, I keep telling people, people keep looking at mobile payments there as P2P. I said, no, it's not P2P. It's actually more of value chain settlements happening, within the informal sector. So the impact is actually there. It's rapid and it's immediate. Like for Motec, for instance, I actually shared offices when we moved to Ghana with Grameen. We're actually sharing offices. I actually saw what Motec was doing. I actually saw the impact. Based on Motec, there's actually a company now in Ghana called Maza, which I'm on the board of. Maza is actually providing transport, because the next stage is transportation, because that's what I was actually going to mention it. We had different stages, in Africa. At first, it was governance. Then it was infrastructure. Then we now started having technology. Even in technology, at first it was the PC. Then we now got the internet. Now it's mobile. Okay? Now everything all works together. You can't, take one and say, okay, look, this is going to create impact without, adding the other. For Maza, we discovered that yes, you can give these guys access to healthcare through mobile phones. But what if they can't even get to the hospital? What if they don't have transportation? So we started financing ambulances, tricycle ambulances for the local people there, to actually the triage services, like you mentioned, provide triage services and all of that, for pregnant women in northern Ghana. So that's real impact. So that's mobile and transportation fused together in Maza. So it's already happening, and it's not going to stop.
That's wonderful to hear, and thank you all for telling us about the healthcare, the education, and like Victor was saying, real impact that's already happening. Although I do have a sheet full of questions, but I know that we also have a really eager audience who want to ask questions from our extremely knowledgeable panelists. So I'll open this up to the audience, and please raise. And we already have a lot of questions. I think his hand went up first, so let's start with him, and then we can come to you and you.
Thank you. This is Kwesi Akwa again from Ghana. And so I'm just looking 10 years ahead and looking at technology and innovation. One of the things I don't think we've paid attention to is the data coming out. I'm a statistician, by the way. The data coming out and of this technology and how we fully utilize that. What I see from most international organizations, they will go to Africa, get their own data, store it in some place, and another company will come along and go and get the same data for a different purpose, and all these companies have their own data sitting somewhere that others don't even know about. Should we be looking into that area very seriously and almost come up with some database of, information and put some analytics on top of that? Or is that too big that everybody has to just keep doing their own stuff and hopefully we're all going to find our different golden nuggets?
Your point is very well taken, and just to really reinforce what you just mentioned, a lot of the RFPs that are coming out, that's requests for proposals that are coming out now, are really for data visualization and analytic systems and not data collection systems. To the extent that we as a company have now signed up a partnership with the data visualization company, and what we learned in the process is that the creating an enterprise visualization analytics platform, it's a lot more complicated than one might think, and that's why the SAPs have excelled in that space. Even and then you had the Cognos systems from IBM. So it was a very expensive space. It was a very domain expert space, and it's just now that we're seeing third-party solutions that allow us to plug and play, whereby the data that is collected from applications such as ours now can be made easily available in an affordable way. But as early as 3 years ago, if you really want to do analytics, you almost were resigned to sign a contract with IBM and SAP to do that level of analytics, and many of us just couldn't carry that on our balance sheet. So the data was buried. But I think we're seeing a shift towards that, and having also a lot of innovation happening in the data warehouse segment that allows for real-time mobile analysis, and that's why the Ubers and stuff now can excel very easily without having to go into too much data crunching in-house. Yeah, but that's sort of my reaction as a company to your question, and it's very valid.
Because this is actually a very, very interesting question. Thank you very much for the question. There's a company called OpenLink Software. These guys are based in Boston. The founder is actually a Nigerian guy, Kingsley there. He started talking about this thing 20 years ago in Africa. We didn't even know what he was talking about. He kept on, even in the West, you still have massive data silos that are actually separated, that are not linked. In Africa, it's actually worse. because okay, we're actually creating, we have the opportunity to actually leapfrog all of the legacy problems that they had, in the West. If we start, having, things like linked data and open data, platforms right now. Because I keep telling people, because the next phase of transcendence is actually about knowledge. Do you get what I'm saying? Not we've passed the infrastructure stage. Even though we still have infrastructure problems, like knowledge, because all those connections are useless if we do not use the knowledge. Okay? Now, we have a phenomenal opportunity in Africa to actually, do something very, very different. And I keep telling people, like, the next product, the next $1 billion product or whatever is going to come from Africa. It's not going to come from the West anymore, because, like, that's why I keep saying Africa is the next frontier. There are a whole lot of things there. There's a lot of data we are sitting on that, that never existed before, that nobody, even knew was there, and that knowledge is what's going to actually, lead to further transcendence, and the biggest place to collect all of that mobile data is actually the mobile platform. The amount of data telcos generate in a year is just actually unbelievable.
I just would add on to that too. Yeah. Back to my earlier comment about Twitter, and I wrote a paper about 3-4 years ago about Facebook being a proxy for hospital quality, based upon a 25 hospital cluster analysis we did in the New York metropolitan area. The Peruvian Medical Association wrote a follow-up letter to the American Journal of Medical Quality the next month, saying that they actually did a similar analysis in Peru and found it to be true, and how much money this would save the Peruvian government going forward on data collection. So a lot of the data that's sitting out there is actually now social media data, and it is open source, relatively speaking, and it is accessible. So let's not, again, going back to the Twitter Ebola case study, let's not forget about that as well in terms of accessing data. And just to back up what Moko said earlier, the Gates Grand Challenge call just came out this week, and one of the grand challenges was data analytics in Africa. So you're absolutely right. This is where a lot of it's going.
I just want to make a comment as a follow-on to the question around data. I'm an investor in a mobile payments company out of West Africa in Sierra Leone. And part of the decision to invest in this company 4 years ago was my feeling that the data will be more valuable, or quite valuable in aggregate, right? So you have a lot of mobile platforms that capture data, and a lot of people have talked about silos, and that's true. I think part of the challenge is if you look at any business and you think about the primary function of a telco or even mobile payments, the opportunity is so large that any sensible person will focus on that primary driver of return for them, which might be transactions fees, payments that people are making for using the phones, right? Now, at some point of maturity, that data, they might start thinking about it. But the data is valuable today, right? And it's valuable more so in aggregate. So I've spent actually the last year and a half thinking about that. How do you find ways to create data consortiums, for example, where you can access some of this transaction level data and aggregate it to create insights? And Victor talked about information. I think, in my view, the term is insights, right? Because you can provide raw data, to some extent, even what I'd call improved data. But I think the marketplace wants insights, actionable insights, right? And they want to know that it's factual, it's facts-based, and with a lot of the technology platforms being built today, that data is verifiable, it's auditable, there's a clear path, right? And it's undisputable to some extent because you can see the trail. So I think that opportunity is huge, and particularly in Africa where, as Victor was alluding to, you're innovating and you're bringing things in where there is no substitute, right? So with mobile phones, the substitute for mobile phones in Nigeria when they first rolled out was I spent half a day going across town to go talk to my supplier who might not be there. And I spent the next half a day going back, and I've lost a day's worth of wages, time. So if you're telling me I can use a mobile phone to sort of replace that, then you can imagine, even if it's X amount, it's cheaper, right? And I think that's the way we need to think about some of these issues and challenges and innovation. It's like, what's the substitute? And in some cases, there isn't, right? So a lot of people would latch onto whatever that pathway is to get that return. Sorry, that's a little bit of an aside. But so around the data, I think that there's huge opportunities to start saying, and we've actually spent some time in some conversations, how do you harvest some of that data that sits in all these silos that oftentimes is actually pretty good and they look similar, and create aggregate level information that allows you now to formalize the informal sector. Because what's happening is the informal sectors are so large, and a lot of innovation is addressing issues in the informal sector, that if you can now pull that information out, and it's real time in many cases, it's a lot more efficient than economic data coming out from the stats bureaus. It's a lot more efficient. It's actually very reactive. Something happens, the data changes, and you can see that. And I think if we're able to bring and harvest that data and put it in forms that are usable, the software, the platforms to analyze, they're becoming commoditized. Everyone seems to be building. So I think that's the key. How do you capture that data in aggregate, store it, house it, and create insights?
The fact that IBM just paid 7x for Truven. Did you guys see that acquisition a couple weeks ago? So Truven, healthcare data company, they were out for sale for the last year or so. Couldn't get a buyer. Maybe they were getting like 3x maybe on the market for the offer. IBM came up and bought them up for 7x. So that's all they had. Truven is a data aggregator. And if you think about that and you continue to work your business model in Africa and go to once in a few years with a lot of data, you'll probably see a similar acquisition.
I'm sorry, I can, back to what you were saying about aggregate data. There's something we found out, like across all the networks, all the cell phone networks, they actually use exactly the same agent network. There's actually, except maybe for Safaricom in Kenya that had some exclusivity at some point. Everybody uses the same agent network, the same people. And, there's a whole lot of data sitting there that, people do not even realize. That's kind of aggregate data. I think, we're now beginning to, tap into it. What we do with it, is another matter entirely. So thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Rhonda, and I'm glad that we're at this subject. I heard through the panels several times a company came to mind. It's a global company in Durham called Aware, and they're actually doing just what you're talking about. For instance, when you brought Dr. Moka, you talked about the farming. They're actually capturing in Kenya and several other countries in East Africa the data that's coming from the farmers that they can actually capture on their phones and use. And this is information from forecasting, but also, building on, for instance, like the Gates Foundation and several others. For instance, all these different entities are sending grain, and they're sending it all over Africa. Well, they found out they're not being used. Why? And they don't know, first of all, if you have, UNICEF and all these different entities sending the same things to the same place, and they're not even aware of one another, how do we get that information? So Aware was actually, with many different foundations, they were commissioned to actually go out and find this information and then send it out. And so they are doing exactly what you're saying in the aggregate analytics space. They're been around for 20 years. So you definitely want to check them out. They're over, is it the American Tobacco in Durham. They used to be in Chapel Hill.
Hi, great presentation, everyone. My name is Mary, and I really enjoyed listening to you all. My question to the panel, especially Dr. Stan, is to ask, in which ways are you working with government? Because you're all doing such important work, and so far on the panel, I've heard about private-to-private partnerships, I've heard about Gates Foundation, but I'm yet to hear anything about your collaboration or partnerships with government. I'm not sure if you're doing it, but I'd love to hear it, because oftentimes government creates policies, and some of the data that you're sharing might be useful in enabling sort of, their knowledge base or expanding that.
Yeah, just 2 seconds. Motec was entirely government driven, so it was being run by the Ghanaian Health Service. and it was being implemented by public health workers for and employed by the Ghanaian Health Service. So that was a complete. That was actually Gates and Grameen, Gates funded, Grameen implemented, HitLab studied, Ghanaian Health Service implemented as well project. So I think anytime you're talking about massive health system change or even small, effective, impactful health system change, you're talking about in some way, shape, or form linking into what the government's doing. There are certainly a lot of phenomenal transformational tools now that are more B2C, if you will. And so we're seeing a lot of that in like we've heard. I think there's an extraordinary amount of transformation happening from a B2C level, whether it's payment or whether it's community and those sorts of things. So, but yeah, when you're looking at direct care, treatment, diagnosis, prevention, you're really talking about making sure that it's being driven by government.
That's a very important question, and there are two sides to the equation. What we are experiencing as a company is that there is lack of a procurement, a process to procure systems. Because when it concerns government, you're really not buying the application, you're buying almost a system, if you will, systems adoption. What does that mean? If you are able to collect data, you need to have a data warehouse process, you need analytics reporting system, but here's where it gets expensive: training, incentives, policing, taking actions based on the data that's been collected. And so if you don't have follow through on making sure that there are the proper incentives in place, the proper feedback from the data that is being collected, you have a wholesale rejection. We did pilots in our first 15 sites were government sites. And the nurses asked us wholesale, we've been putting data in this system, no decision has been made differently, we stopped using it. So let's kind of put it in that perspective, and you realize that, for governments to move in this direction of adopting technology, it is more than just buying the software. It is more than the equipment. It requires a wholesale adoption of processes, incentives, and enforcing management principles that are consistent with enterprise data solutions. And that's where there's the gap. So that sort of forces us to kind of say, well, if we have to stay in business, let's kind of go directly to the consumer and look for value there. So that's been a challenge. Secondly, when you talk about government, our competitive landscape changes. For almost all tenders that are government tenders, we're going against the multinationals. And that is, it makes, I cannot cite too many instances whereby small to medium-sized enterprises that are Africa-based have won those tenders. A lot of the tenders are won by either US-based organizations, if it's a USAID grant, or UK-based organizations, if it's a UK aid grant. And that's the nature of the landscape, again, because you have to demonstrate a certain level of capacity in order to go after government contracts. So in a way, it's sort of, we're caught up between the ability to supply to government and also the ability for government to use our services. And so it's there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I'd like to, however, conclude by saying that Rwanda is demonstrating a lot of leadership in that space, where they are investing at multiple levels. In terms of having the universities, they have a program that is government funded with Carnegie Mellon to create a lot of talent, whereby government can absorb that capacity to manage the systems. Otherwise, if you build it in the private sector, governments cannot manage systems. In governments as we know them, it requires a very unique investment in building that capacity to manage databases, do the visualizations, generate the reports, put the reports in the hands of the minister. In Kenya, for our visualization partner, the head of state has an app in front of his table where he monitors HIV data every day. So he has the appetite, but he does not have the capacity to manage that even at the level of the State House. So, there's definitely a net trend, but there is still a lot. I mean, the procurement process has to be changed. I've usually said you need a procurement reform because government is used to buying training services and commodities. They're not used to buying systems. And that's a very different level kind of contracting agreement.
I have a very, very radical view about government, and governance in Africa. I think, African governance is largely dysfunctional. So I don't even. That's why you see me. I rarely talk about government because I have a lot of disdain for government and regulators. M-Pesa, you can argue that, okay, look, there was some government influence, in it, and that was why. But I think the main reason M-Pesa succeeded was because the government wasn't even looking in that direction. Once you have less regulation, once you have less interference, innovation happens. That's my experience, in Africa. But if you look at Nigeria, by the time the government now realized, okay, look, they need to regulate this industry to death, nothing happened. I have a customer that we actually went in there. We had 1 million subscribers, on our network in less than 2 weeks. The government clamped down on it and said, no, okay, you can't do it because you're not allowed to. So that's my own personal problem with government. Like Dr. Walker rightly said, we have a huge talent problem, in government. These guys cannot even begin to understand, what's the magnitude of problems, that we have to deal with. I have a client in Ghana, a pension trust. I went through, the process of regulatory reporting with them, and they told me, look, the government still insists that they send their reports by paper, and I was saying, why? You can actually send all of this to, I said, no, they still insist. So he sends them a CD and still prints all the paper and gives to them, and he knows that the paper is not going to be read. Nothing is ever going to happen. So, there needs to also be transcendence in government before, any meaningful engagement can happen. A whole lot needs to happen. So right now, I think government is actually a hindrance rather than, because I remember there was one event I went to in Cambodia, Wings. They were asking them, okay, why did you guys succeed? How did you guys succeed? And what happened? The guy showed a bombed out building. So that was the regulator. That's why we succeeded, because the regulator was not there. So that's my view. I think less government, more innovation. So thank you.
Guys, this would be the last question, respecting the time of our panelists and you guys. After this question, we'll officially end the session. However, you feel free to come down, ask questions after the panel.
No pressure on me. Thank you so much for coming down. It's been a pleasure listening to you. This question is perhaps more relevant to Victor and Dr. Mocha. I wanted to discuss another stakeholder that you very likely work with quite frequently, which are these large corporate companies, which could be clients, which could be competitors, could be partners. On the one hand, they see the same large opportunity in the market as you do. And on the other hand, you really need them because, it's hard to establish that service delivery model. You want to tag on to existing ecosystems as much as you can. How do you see this relationship playing out? Do you see them as competitors? Do you see them as exit options? Do you see them as just helpful partners?
That's actually very, 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 it's a very good question. Nigeria, obviously you've heard all of the stories that happen, with the regulator finding one of the players there and, all of what's happening. I think we have the wrong mindset in Africa, when we keep looking at these people as the villains. Because these guys actually, they've done a whole lot. They created, something where there was nothing, like as Akin mentioned, and they themselves actually also need to be educated, on things like, collaboration, working with people and all of that. And, to be quite honest, from all my experiences, with all the large companies, even some from San Francisco and those already in Africa, I think, there's there's this mindset change that has happened, because they've realized that discontinuity can happen at any time. One point, is it $15 billion that the government is now saying to find them can actually end MTN totally. All of those things is actually changing the mindset of these players. So they're not, and they themselves, they know. MTN invested in African Internet Holdings, the largest internet holding company in Africa. I remember when I met with the chief commercial officer and I asked them, okay, look, why did you guys do this? He told me, simply, the future is digital. We are putting a bet on the future, and any sensible entity, will do that. The largest growth in value, in America has come from Silicon Valley, because those guys put bets, in the future of digital. And those guys are actually doing the same thing, in Africa right now. So, for me, I believe, there needs to be more understanding, on both sides. The data is also very, 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 very important. These companies have also realized that they need to collaborate, because between MTN and Airtel, like their platforms are now interfacing. You now have cross-border transfers. They're not seeing themselves as as mortal enemies anymore. You have acquisitions happening. Like you talked about exits and all of that. Not necessarily for players like us, but the landscape is changing. It depends on what tomorrow brings. But right now, I think everything is in a state of flux, and these guys realize that. I think was in I've forgotten what country that they said vast revenue dropped by 80% just because of WhatsApp. They realize that discontinuity is real, is there. So it's not these guys could just cease to exist tomorrow if they don't collaborate.
Definitely, it's what's being called now in industry jargon sector 4 strategy, and so most companies have what they call a sector 4 strategy. And there are 3 flavors. Some are still using the CSR arm. Others have created what is called the Corporate Sustainability Development Officer, who is now looking at SMEs as sustainable development partners to get into the emerging market space. And then those who are really more aggressive have created what's calling market access offices. So we are trying to figure out in that spectrum where the large corporations are, and fortunately, we've had the opportunity to deal with each of them. Some of the early lessons learned on both sides is that a lot of the corporations, the large corporations, are structured and not yet ready for partnership with small to medium enterprises. In country, they have sales and marketing teams and contracting teams. Those guys cannot make the decisions to engage us. Basically, it just doesn't happen. So it puts an imperative on us to look for ways to connect with headquarters. And as you know, getting to headquarters is not something that is easy to do. What we've learned in the process is that we have to work with the Accentures, the McKinseys, the Deloittes, and the, you name it, the big consulting firms who define the corporate strategies for a lot of these big companies for the emerging markets. We work with them, kind of get them we want to be visible in terms of what value we can create for them and what value we need from them, and then they have a better batting average. That has worked with us for SAP, with Huawei Technologies, and with Boehringer Ingelheim. So we've used consulting firms to be able to negotiate those relationships. And the second part of the equation is that when those corporations do make the decision to move forward, the reporting requirements are enormous. So basically, I've had to build capacity, reporting capacity within our organization to just deal with reporting to corporations. And actually very sophisticated analysis. They want to know what is the value of our service to their business and how are we creating impact in the BOP. And so they are being very, very, there's a lot of high risk, if you put it, and nobody wants to be burned. So they are putting in all the checks and balances in place. And it's just a matter now of, how can we navigate that until you have maybe a success story that would allow them to ease their hands on the steering wheel. But right now they are making that commitment, but it is happening at the highest level in those companies. With Huawei, the CEO of Huawei signed up on an agreement with an SME. That gives you a sense of how much visibility is required to have those partnerships to be established.
Also remember that Darwin didn't say it's the survival of the fittest. Darwin said it's the survival of the most adaptable. And a lot of the corporates that are in Africa right now are not necessarily focused on healthcare, but they do have healthcare plays. So some of the biggest grant funds I've received over the last 10 years have been from Qualcomm and Cisco and Ericsson. And they have usually nothing to do with healthcare, except they all realize that within the next frontier, healthcare is a large percentage of what's going to be that GDP. And so there's a huge opportunity within those corporates, whether it's through the corporate itself or even the corporate foundation, to do ancillary work. So for instance, with Boehringer Ingelheim or Pfizer or J&J, they have enormous amounts of activity when they're trying to understand epidemiology and things like that. So there's an ancillary play if you're an electronic medical record system in collecting data and helping them understand clinical trial populations and ancillary epidemiology populations, population health trends, so that they can figure out how to create the next vaccine and that sort of thing. So there are a number of things to do, whether it's with a wireless company from India, a tech company from the EU or North America, where healthcare technologies, healthcare mobile technologies can have a play within them, but think a little bit differently. And again, remember the Zuckerberg dorm room case study where it just requires some pivoting, maybe 1 or 2 degrees north or south to find that perfect placement. And then there might be not only a diffusive product for their company, but also diffusive in terms of having impact within Africa. And again, I think if we're more impact driven and not profit driven, we're going to see much more scalability globally.
Add a little bit to that. I remember you were talking about Everett Rogers' book, Definition of Innovations. A whole lot of cultural change, is happening even within those corporates, in Africa, because they've realized that models, cut and paste models don't work. Because something worked in Zimbabwe doesn't mean it's going to work the same way, in Nigeria. And like rightly said, it's the survival of the most adaptable. It's not the survival of the fittest. So if you do not adapt, you don't exist. So that's just it. So it's actually it's in their own interest, to be adaptable rather than be confrontational.
All right.
Yeah.
So I would say thank you very much. What a great thought to end this as the survival of the most adaptable. I think everyone in this room will agree that all nations in Africa are probably the most adaptable nations in the world. So with this, I'm thanking the panel. Thank you for being here. Thank you for actually enlightening us. Here's a memento.
Thank you very much. Thank you.